This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we're talking with historian Richard Gamble on the 100th year anniversary of America's entry into World War I and how that fateful decision changed the course of our country's self-understanding. Richard Gamble is the author of The War for Righteousness, Progressive Christianity, The Great War, and the Rise of the Messianic Nation. He is also Associate Professor of History and Anna Margaret Ross Alexander Chair in History and Political Science at Hillsdale College. He is the author of In Search of the City on a Hill, The Making and Unmaking of American Myth. Richard Gamble, glad to have you on the program again. Last you were on to discuss In Search of the City on a Hill. So in many ways, this is a related topic, America 100 years on from entering World War I. A question that comes to my mind was our entry into World War I an inevitability as it's been presented to us in conventional historical terms?
That's a great question, Richard, and thanks for having me on again. The question of historical inevitability is something that makes historians very nervous. We don't like to engage in historical determinism, and there's the fear, and I think a well-placed fear, that if we are too sure about the outcome of the events we're studying, then we're going to impose an interpretation onto them. It's like knowing the end of the movie while you're watching the beginning, and it can really distort the way you interpret the events, the action, the words that are being spoken. So was it inevitable? There are historians right now in the most recent literature on the war who are making that argument. And I think to some degree they're making that argument in a responsible way. Like, given these circumstances, given these constraints, given the behavior of the Allied powers and the Central powers, did America have any reasonable choice other than war by 1916, 1917? And if that's what they mean by inevitable, I think you can make a very good case that if any one of us were a decision maker, were the chief executive, the commander-in-chief back in 1917, we may have felt that we had run out of any other option but intervention. So in that sense, inevitable, but as far as the trajectory of some grand American destiny, as some preview of America's role in World War II or the Cold War or the War on Terror, then we really have to be much more restrained, much more modest in the kinds of claims we're going to make about the First World War.
So let's say, and we could talk a lot about Woodrow Wilson, extraordinarily complicated figure, and his self-understanding, how theology and political ideology mesh in his worldview. But any president at that time who had tried to keep America neutral in the year 1917, from what I've read, faces the prospect of Great Britain going broke. We were largely providing them with food, material, all sorts of things to help carry on the war, my understanding. But if you didn't intervene, you would have watched Great Britain fail to German forces. That seemed to be something of an inevitability. And France as well seemed to be out of steam. And so could you just watch that happen?
Right. And I'm coming to understand better that the debate or the conversation going on in American society and American politics in the war years is, what do we picture a post-World War Europe looking like? What do we imagine the power dynamic, the balance of power, the economy of Europe looking like after this war? And there is a lot of concern of what Europe will be like dominated by Germany. Do we really want France to suffer in this way? Do we really want Britain to suffer in this way? And we have a much longer history with those two empires. And older alliances or coordination between our own policies and theirs. So those are really important questions that America had to grapple with. Not just what does this war mean, but what will one outcome of this war mean if Germany is victorious? What will it mean for Russia? All these questions and the future stability of both Western and Eastern Europe. So those are critical questions. And I think over the last couple of years, my own thinking about the war has turned more and more to the question of what's the alternative to Woodrow Wilson? Can we imagine, being very careful about spinning out some alternative history that didn't happen, but can we imagine a more realist president feeling compelled to take America to war in these years? And I think the answer is yes. I'm not taking a position on whether that was the wisest option at the time, but I think we can clearly say that there were realist reasons, strategic, economic, reasons based in American interest that might have looked like they were compelling America to war. And that's worth reminding ourselves, especially if we give the attention that Wilson deserves to his theology, as you mentioned, to his idealism, to his very abstract and spiritualized way of thinking about the war. Underneath all that, there were also realist reasons to go into this war. And I've thought about, this might be a very difficult assignment, but I've thought about asking my own students, maybe in an upper-level class, to write a different version of Wilson's war message from April 1917. What if you were a realist statesman in the older tradition of American foreign policy? Given what you know about German behavior, given what you know about the condition of Britain and France and Russia in these years, now write a speech asking Congress for a declaration of war. I think that's possible to do. And I think it would be a very helpful mental exercise.
Interesting. So that sort of brings up the election of 1912.
Yeah.
In a way, the ill-fated election of 1912. I suppose Theodore Roosevelt, another complicated figure in his own right, American nationalist, but yet widely acknowledged by most when he approached foreign policy to do so on the basis of, okay, what are the means and resources I have at my disposal, and that shapes the ends I think I can accomplish. One can imagine him engaging in a different justification for the war. I don't know how differently he would have fought that war, but certainly there would have been no 14 points. There would have been no Versailles Treaty. There would have been no harsh insistence, I think, on who was to blame and the costs and how those should be divvied up under his type of a presidency. I mean, this is all counterfactual history, but one can see a different course taking shape. But that sort of brings the question, though, I think, of how America entered World War I. As you know, progressive rhetoric had become a part of our national foreign policy thinking for 20 years at least, prior to entering World War I. So in a way, Americans had become prepped to think of themselves as a country that should get involved internationally, not necessarily for American realist or nationalist reasons, but to do good. Things. And as you write in your book, The War for Righteousness, progressive clergy, Protestant clergy were at the forefront.
Absolutely. And your 20-year mark there is alluding back to the Spanish-American War.
And Albert Beverages, senator from Indiana, interestingly enough.
Right. And his speeches are almost hard to caricature. They are just over-the-top progressive justifications for what Walter McDougall calls a crusader nation. They're just full-throated celebrations of America as God's new Israel. Really, really extraordinary pieces. And President McKinley in 1898, as he's explaining to Congress the reasons for war against Spain, for the liberation of Cuba, we can hear in his speech a justification for war that appeals to a Christian humanitarianism. That's not exclusively what he does. It's not even predominantly what he does. We find there the oldest reasons for war that there are. We find an appeal to American security, to American economic interests, to America's fears for the region. We hear appeals to for the well-being of the Cuban people, but embedded in there is this idealism that justifies war as a humanitarian act, a benevolent act. Now, he's surrounded by social gospel clergy.
He also, William McKinley also connected the war in the Philippines. We're going to show them Christianity too, which is astounding on a number of levels.
Right. And the war in the Philippines is in some ways an even bigger turning point for America. Cuba had been on America's to-do list for a while, and the fear there was if any powerful European nation controlled it, then that would be very bad news for American security. So there were a lot of reasons for America to be interested in Cuba, but then to extend American power all the way to the Philippines and to talk in these extravagant terms like we were mentioning about Beveridge and so many of the social gospel clergy did, that this is somehow a fulfillment of America's divine calling in the world, then we are in new territory. And over the next 20 years, that becomes really second nature to Americans. We see it in the press. We hear it from the pulpits. We hear it from the political platform saying, America, this is who you are. You are this messianic nation, and therefore this is what you owe to the world. And this kind of a foreign policy, to me, this is a critical point. This kind of a foreign policy does not mark any betrayal of American founding principles. It marks actually the fulfillment of those principles. We now get to globalize what America was founded for.
This sparks an interesting question, too. So you mentioned the social gospel. So I guess I'm thinking, is this is sort of a background understanding. At one level, are there any significant parts of Christianity in America that demur, that dissent from this understanding? The way in which you presented the war for righteousness, as at least in Woodrow Wilson's mind, and in the justifications that are offered, there really is widespread agreement on at least amongst clergy that America should assume this role, a forward progressive role in the world, which in many ways also means that the nature of Christianity has been changed, that it's now something about redeem the time or redeem the world understanding. So seems to me there's a lot of symbols being inverted here.
Oh yes. This is the kind of stuff that Eric Vogelin built a career out of. It's that kind of political Gnosticism there, and yes, wow, where even to begin here? It's I do believe that there were resources to resist this. There were those in the major denominations, in Protestantism and in Catholicism, who had the capacity to resist this. In American Judaism, had the capacity to resist this kind of appeal, and the distortions of this when Christianity was instrumentalized this way into an agency of either domestic reform or foreign interventionism. There were those who tried to maintain the integrity of the church, tried to hold back or to restrain these extravagant ways of talking about redeeming redeeming America, redeeming the world, waging righteous warfare. And that's really a story that I think somebody could focus on and write a whole book on, those dissenting voices that were not extreme left-wing pacifists, that were, in fact, maybe far more conservative than the mainstream, and are actually trying to calm everybody down and keep all this on planet Earth.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too. I mean, to put this together, I mean, I'm thinking there's tremendous economic gains during this period of American
Oh,
history.
yes.
Tremendous scientific gains. Lives are becoming better. We've also got this is a massive wave of immigration
Right.
during this period. All of these things coming together. See, I've always just thought of it as it all. People thought, well, what's the next frontier?
Right.
What's the next thing to achieve, to accomplish with all of this power? And I think, and certainly I wouldn't necessarily trace it back to Abraham Lincoln, but there is also the country being unified in a way it wasn't previously, by the Civil War, by the outcome in that conflict, seeming to make the country seem more unified or more at home than it had been previously in its self understanding.
Right, right. I think that's true. Certainly, something we recognize as a national identity, a national consciousness. Some of that's really deliberate. Not to get us too far off track, but if you go back to something like Senator Charles Sumner's speech in 1867, the title of it is "Are We a Nation?" And his answer to that is pretty stunning. Yes, we are a modern unitary nation state, and he's thinking on the European model here. And that damages our constitutional understanding. I think it damages any conception we have of what it means to be a federated republic of limited power, limited government with a lot of localized self-rule. And the connection between that and American imperialism is a complicated one, but certainly there are voices worried in the late 19th century that a centralized, powerful American nation state would have few restraints on a quest for empire, that it would actually lose some of its older exceptionalism by trying to be just like the ambitious European powers.
Yeah, so let's think about, I mean, and I want to get into Woodrow Wilson here, but what's the baseline of comparison? I mean, if for Woodrow Wilson it's a war for democracy or a war to end all wars and putting American forces into an idealistic pursuit, the baseline that we would compare that statecraft against, I think, would be maybe George Washington's statecraft, the farewell address. So, we only engage in military conflict to protect the Union, to protect the Republican Constitution, national interests. We recognize reciprocity. We accord nations, we treat nations the way we want to be treated. There's neutrality. We're neutral, where we strive to be neutral as far as we can. We don't favor other nations over others. So we strive for friendship, and just in an overall awareness of restraint, of the calculation of means and ends, what you can actually achieve when you think you do need to do something, and that's I think the baseline tradition in American foreign policy thinking. And then the progressives, in the words of Walter McDougall, sort of replace that classic civil religion with a new or a progressive civil religion, and it comes and there's something else involved in it. And the way I read it, and this is probably too broad, it's largely been the way we've thought about American power through most of the 20th century, up until really the failure of George W. Bush's war in Iraq.
Right. Right, I would agree. And maybe like another baseline or part of that same baseline you mapped out would be Wilson's own contemporary, Grover Cleveland. Here's a man who worried about the projection of American power, worried about empire. He was the one who withdrew the Treaty of Annexation from consideration by the Senate, negotiated by his predecessor, Harrison, for the Hawaiian Islands. He infuriated the expansionists in the U.S. Senate when he withdrew that treaty, and they condemned him in the press. But there's a man, and incidentally, something I've been thinking about even just this morning, Grover Cleveland was an old school Presbyterian. And here you have Woodrow Wilson, more of a modern new school Presbyterian, and so many of his contemporaries and historians ever since have said, well, he acts this way because of his Calvinism or his Presbyterianism. And I just want to say, wait a minute, we have other Presbyterian statesmen and presidents who are acting in according to different principles. So we have to look a little deeper to the kinds of things you mentioned a moment ago, to this diluted, idealized kind of Christianity that has been cut off from its moorings in Orthodox theology and its ecclesiology, and has been radically instrumentalized into a tool for social change.
No, I mean, I think in preparing for this interview, I think I read a quote from Woodrow Wilson directly that the purpose of the church was to save this society, not the next world.
Yes.
Not to prepare.
Yes. No, in fact, I typed out that quotation this morning. That is from a lecture he gave in October of 1914 in Pittsburgh to a gathering of the YMCA. And he said, as for me, I've never had much patience with thinking about Christianity in terms of individual salvation. It's for transforming society.
Yeah.
Really.
I suppose that as we were thinking about earlier, the dissenting Protestants were in this period the ones that really sort of went into hiding.
Yeah.
Really I don't know, up until the 60s or up until they just couldn't take it anymore and they decided to come out. And then we had, what we conventionally think of as maybe as the new religious right, which emerged. But they largely didn't have, I think maybe their biggest voice was the Princeton professor.
That's right.
Gresham Machen.
Machen, yeah, that's right. Yep.
Yes.
He makes a good counterpoint to Wilson there. Two men right there in Princeton at the same time with very different theologies and even their view of war and foreign policy. But the liberals in the church, the progressives in the church, had come to dominate the seminaries, the publishing houses, the churches, the movement for church federation. So those who were articulating such things as the Methodist social creed of the churches, this was dominant and mainstream. When I think about my own family's past in the Presbyterian Church in New Jersey, that's what my grandparents were hearing in the early 20th century. A very earthly gospel of social transformation, and it was easy for them to believe that a war could be an instrument of world transformation.
Yeah, so that's getting into World War One or America's entry into World War One. We'll get your reaction. John Milton Cooper, as you know, one of Woodrow Wilson's biographers, most important biographers, says, quote, "But one incontrovertible fact remains. The United States entered World War One because Woodrow Wilson decided to take the country in," end quote. So he's the indispensable figure, according to John Milton Cooper, in our entry into World War One. My question for you is, though, Americans were aware of the carnage.
Oh, yeah.
It really is an amazing thing that we entered and that Americans got behind this. Talk about what country we became, though, once we entered. What had to be done, in essence, to make this case for war and to keep it going?
Oh, right. And like I often do with my students, I'm probably going to end up just making your question more complicated.
Sure, please do.
As I think through this, you're right that America didn't enter this war naively in 1914 with the other great powers. America had been reading daily about the carnage on both the Eastern Front and the Western Front. America knew the casualty figures of Verdun and the Somme. And it was that war that America entered, not some hypothetical war, not some impending war. America entered that war of unimaginable, unbelievable
Verdun,
carnage.
100,000 soldiers died in total, right, at Verdun.
I don't have the figures fresh, but it's a staggering number, right?
Yeah.
And over the course of 10 months or so, it's upwards of that figure.
Wow. That's incredible. So thinking about America getting into World War I, so we have this country, largely from everything that I've read, our defense forces, not what they are now. A standing army, but a pretty small one. And
Right.
Wilson's aim is to send 1 million men to Europe, from what I've read. That's his goal.
Right.
And so a tremendous mobilization effort underway.
Yes, absolutely. And Germany knows this, and this is part of the rationale behind Germany's decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare that they announced in February 1917. They know that America is militarily unprepared. America has been building its Navy, and that's more of a traditional thing to do, but its Army is almost non-existent. It's been capable of more or less a police action in Mexico, but there's nothing like what America will need to send to Europe. And Germany believes, almost correctly, that it has enough time before America can mobilize to sink enough tonnage of merchant ships heading to Britain and France that it will be able to starve the British out and bring the war to a negotiated end. So they are banking on America's unpreparedness. And it takes, this is really stunning looking back from the 21st century, where we can act anywhere in the world on a moment's notice with overwhelming force, to think that America was able to send a small token force under Pershing by July of 1917, but there is no serious, large-scale American action until almost a year later. It's in 1918 that we see American action largely through the Argonne Forest. That's unbelievable, and that's a measure of just what kind of a nation America was prior to this war. So you mentioned transformation. America was changed into a modern, mobilized military power through the course of this war, and that's why one of the biggest questions of all in the 1920s was, would America be able to retrace its steps? Would it be able to return to what Harding memorably calls normalcy? What will that ever look like? And, we have what Robert Higgs calls the ratchet effect here. And the size of the bureaucracy never goes back to what it was. The size of the military never goes back to what it was. The degree of intervention in the U.S. economy never goes back to what it was.
Read a quote from you. This is from Woodrow Wilson, Flag Day, 1917.
Yes.
He says, this is a people's war for freedom and self-government amongst all the nations of the world. And woe be to that man or that group of men that seeks to stand in our way in this day of high resolution, end quote. So how you hear a speech like that, there's really not a lot of room for honest opposition in Woodrow Wilson's mind. This is the president of your country. Overwhelming support, voting for a declaration of war in the Congress as well. And we know there was a propaganda campaign, mail opening campaign, but people's mail was read. There was an active attempt, the Sedition Act, to punish dissent in America. And it is incredible when you read these stories of what happened to our country during World War I, to think about how quickly the country changes from these classical liberal principles to the federal government actively stamping out opposition to a war. Or even just at the level of talking about ideas. It's an amazing thing. And then the draft, conscription, and I think, what was it, 50,000 soldiers or 120,000 soldiers died?
Yes, that's from both disease and combat.
So that is, and it seems to require. It seems where this total war effort required. Maybe it did require to pull it off. It required Woodrow Wilson and this sort of political, religious faith being joined together, or at least interrelated to understand sort of a salvific purpose for all of this. It was interesting. I took my family to a Memorial Day, uh, not celebrate, but ceremony this week, and very very nice, very moving ceremony, but still the same thing that none of these soldiers will have died in vain. As we look
Right.
back and remember them, and it's almost as if when a nation goes to war, unless it's a war of sort of pure self defense, you really have to put it in those terms, and you really do have to see those opposing you in a new light, in a harsh light.
And that's exactly the kind of conundrum that the great British historian Herbert Butterfield, from whom I took the title War for Righteousness, that's the very thing he was wrestling with. And he feared that he might almost say, like, woe be to us if it's true that a democracy can't be mobilized in any other way. That's not a compliment to modern mass democracy if we can only be mobilized by spiritualizing our warfare in this way. And Butterfield's classic concern there is this ends up breaking down all the constraints on how do you wage limited war if you believe you are going to make the entire world safe for democracy? How do you wage limited war for limited objectives if you're telling the American people that this is the final war in the emancipation of humanity? We like to think that, well, that's so idealistic and that's admirable, because to be idealistic is, of course, inspiring and it's noble. But we have to be so careful about that, because a radically idealized war forgets about limits. It forgets about what warfare can actually achieve in the world and what it can't achieve. And it leads us to, and I'll use strong language here, it leads us to delusional thinking.
Well, yeah, and on the backside of that, I think, is you forfeit a lot of trust when enough people realize they've been had.
Yes.
And it's trust and credibility that a government can never really regain. And I've increasingly come to think about that observation with regard to our own government.
Yeah.
One sense our government, was, so we do win the Cold War. We did, World War I, we prevailed World War II. But this sort of ongoing marshaling of resources for ends that, you think about the Vietnam situation, things that really can't be achieved, the ways in which we say we're going to achieve them or held, lead people thinking, here we go again. Another crisis we have to be mobilized for. Yeah, and it's interesting. I even think of that about with regards to Barack Obama's attempt to, mobilize us for new domestic initiatives. It was almost like he failed to understand the degrees to which Americans didn't trust their government for anything.
Right. And a weariness about all this.
A weariness. Yeah, maybe that's a better term.
Yeah. And maybe.
So talk about public opinion during the war. I mean, I would assume during the mobilization, maybe this was novel, this was new. I mean, I think from perspective I've watched, the best and the brightest from Wall Street rush to be officers. Think about the commemoration in the Harvard Yard or the cemetery about the Harvard students who joined the war effort. So, maybe there was, from what I've read, a lot of support for the war. And then I don't know, how does that hold up for the last 2 years of the war?
Right. Yeah, that was true here on Hillsdale's campus. We have photographs of the young men here standing around the statue of the Union soldier being recruited and signing up for the war effort. So that is going on in communities all over the nation. And there are probably as many motivations as there are people for joining this war. Two of my uncles were drafted into the war, and one ended up serving in the Army Service Corps after the end of the war in France. In fact, I can see from where I'm sitting here his army tunic, and that tunic was in Verdun in 1919. And he was drafted, but his family was also extremely proud of him. He was serving, and families have been proud of soldiers for thousands of years. So there is a noble side to this. There is a self-sacrificial side to this. There are countless Americans who volunteer for ambulance corps, for the Air Corps, for the Army, for the Red Cross, for the YMCA work overseas, thousands and thousands who are doing it simply for no other reason than that their nation has called upon them. And in all of our talk about...
so you're saying there's a common understanding here of just American patriotism.
American patriotism.
Yes.
And young men, and hey, they're young men, and they love the idea of this overseas adventure, and there's a thrill to this that they're eager for. And propaganda is a very big factor, as you mentioned, in World War I, mobilizing these young men, mobilizing the public for...
Well, then the 4-minute speeches, too.
4-minute speeches.
Talk about that for a minute. I thought that was so... The level of coordination there is pretty interesting.
Oh, it's huge. And a lot of this is coming out of the Committee for Public Information, the CPI, headed by George Creel in Washington, D.C., and this is America's first attempt at large-scale publicity to essentially advertise a war, to market a war to the American people. Posters, movies, songbooks, pageants, parades, you name it. And these 4-minute speeches, between the changing of the reels at movie theaters, while the audience is waiting, some prominent local official would get up and give a rousing speech about donating funds to the latest Liberty Loan Drive or later to the Victory Loan Drive. And this is a massive, massive effort at mobilization of public opinion. And this fits into...
I mean, you could only really do that, I think, if public opinion was behind you. And in a way, all you're doing is just trying to direct it in the ways in which you want. I mean, one, it would be impossible to imagine that even in, early 2003.
Right.
I mean,
no, you're exactly right.
I mean,
You're exactly right. And from what I've read, the U.S. government figured out that the best way to control publicity, and this happened in World War II, was to feed the press with a constant stream of press releases. You feed them pre-packaged material, and they will print it. And rather than the more aggressive strategy during the First World War that was paired, the opposite side of publicity was, as you mentioned, suppressing dissent, shutting down newspapers, a newspaper in Charleston, South Carolina, all over the place, shut down because they questioned Wilson, questioned the wisdom of the war. Foreign nationals, there were enough, and it sounds like I'm making this up, but I'm not. There were enough foreign national German musicians in the federal prison in Atlanta to have a full orchestra and a conductor. And they performed during the war. So we were incarcerating just many foreign nationals during the war, and censoring through agencies such as the Council of National Defense. And every state in the Union had its own state council of defense, and every large town in America had its own local council of defense. And these are the kinds of people who would go around and spy on their neighbors and report the suspicious activity if their next-door neighbor refused to give to the latest Red Cross drive. I mean, I've read these documents in South Carolina. So they're reporting on their neighbors in a way that startles us today. Yeah. It sounds like a kind of totalitarianism, but this is that fusion of the public mind that was shockingly successful.
That mobilization for total war.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
I mean, it's interesting to think about how like the John Adams administration opposing what it thought was French insurrection, also using that to attack political opponents
Right.
as it understood them, but of course lacking the machinery or the instruments to
Right.
really implement that vision. So Wilson had public opinion in a new way, in a powerful new way, with the instruments and the abilities to implement it that had not been available in prior opportunities, we could say, in American history.
That's right. I mean, he had the machinery available to him through modern technology, through modern advertising techniques, which were just coming into their maturity there, through film and so on. He had all these means at his disposal, and they experimented with these techniques during the war. But he also brought to bear on the war a conception of public opinion that he had developed years before and already brought to his understanding of domestic reform as well. For him, public opinion was not the aggregate of the views of the majority of the American people. It wasn't. That's not his notion of what America thinks. Public opinion was something to be cultivated by statesmen. Public opinion is something you produce, shape, you form it, and you help people to understand their own interests. And so when Wilson is able to talk about having the backing of the American people, or saying, I think as you quoted earlier, that this is a people's war, he doesn't really have to mean that he has the majority of the American people behind him. What he means is that this enlightened public opinion, this enlightened American consciousness that he has helped shape and given voice to, that's behind him. He understands the real American public opinion. Now, of course, that can't work utterly separated from the willingness of the American people to wage this war. They have to believe what they're fighting in. And my own suspicion is that many Americans are fighting for some pretty old-fashioned, some pretty ordinary reasons for war.
Yeah. Well, thinking, I mean, this is also Wilson carrying public opinion and seeing things in a Manichaean way.
Yes.
Light and darkness, good and evil, and no real principled opposition to what he wants to achieve. And this is also a part of what he sees public opinion as like maybe ratifying what he's doing.
That might be the right word. Yeah.
I lead you in a certain way, and
yes.
And you ratify, but experts are largely going to implement what goes on. So in a way, this is an ongoing renegotiation of American constitutionalism.
Yes.
Applied to foreign policy in this instance, but Wilson, of course, has all sorts of ideas. It's interesting. I did want to push back on something you said earlier, that the ratchet effect.
Yeah.
I mean, it is the case though that after World War I there is a demobilization.
Yes.
Harding and Coolidge don't continue funding them. No, certainly not at wartime levels, obviously, but from what I've read, particularly of Coolidge, there was no desire to keep the military ready or on a wartime footing in any sense in which we think of it. Obviously, their circumstances are vastly different, but they weren't willing to continue with Wilson's legacy, domestic or foreign policy terms.
Right. I think that's largely true. Certainly, the United States Senate rejected American membership in the League of Nations. The United States never ratified the Treaty of Versailles. We negotiated a separate treaty with Germany later. And yet, on the other side, America became more active in international affairs than it had ever been before. It took a leadership role in the Washington Naval Armaments Conference. And the progressive press in America in the 1920s was extolling this as evidence of the new era in international diplomacy. We have the push for the outlawry of war in the late 1920s. There are elements of this. I mean, what you're saying is exactly right. There is a kind of retrenchment in the 20s. There's cutting taxes, cutting expenditures, retiring the national debt from the war. But there is...
So there's a mindset change that the world needs America.
I think there is, and there's a willingness. Even Calvin Coolidge refers to America as the Good Samaritan.
Yeah.
So I haven't made up my own mind on that. I haven't sorted through all that, but it has always seemed to me that there is this, forgive the cliche, but there's a paradigm shift. And while America does come home from World War I, America has a different position relative to the rest of the world after this war, and it knows it. It's an economic superpower. It has changed the balance of power in the world, or it has guaranteed that one balance of power will endure. So America knows this, and it doesn't back away as much as we might think it did.
And I guess it's a setting of a precedent too.
Yes.
Of wartime mobilization and what can be done.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So but we also have to say, in all fairness, you look at the history of the 1930s in the U.S. Congress, and so much of this neutrality legislation hammered out by Congress does reflect a popular mood and a determination not to get back into a European war. So we have to acknowledge that as well. And Franklin Roosevelt has a very difficult time. He knows what he's up against to steer America into another war if that becomes necessary.
Yeah, we also, we could really get into this. We also have the legacy of American rhetoric and America's pretensions about what it can accomplish abroad, and in this case with Pearl Harbor, the ways in which America lectures Japan, acts forcefully against Japan. Maybe that was needed, but yet does not have the resources to back it up. Certainly not in the Philippines or in the Pacific theater, and suffers the consequences for that.
Right.
In my estimation. Richard Gamble, thank you for joining us to talk about the 100-year anniversary of American entry into World War I. This has been excellent.
Thank you so much.
This is your host, Richard Grinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.